Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the May edition of Real Space Strategy Live. I'm your host, Christopher Stone. Thank you for your patience as we work through a little bit of post-Memorial Day technical glitches. Um, Today, we will have an interesting topic for those of you interested in strategic theory and space power, as we will look at two of the theorists quoted from the U.S. Space Force's recently released Space Warfighting Framework. Um, Recently published by the service. Those theorists are, of course, Colin S. and Julian Corbett. So, in order to ensure that everyone on the call is on the same page as what we are discussing today, I have asked two strategist scholars in their own right to provide some background on both Dr. Colin Gray and Julian Corbett, their views and thinking. And so, with that, I'd like to introduce both Dr. M.V. Coyote Smith, who is professor of strategic space studies at Air Command and Staff College. And then later on, hopefully, if everything goes well, Dr. Brent Ziarnick will join us. He is former professor of the Space Forces PME at Johns Hopkins University Space Forces program. And he will elucidate us with his knowledge of Julian Corbett. But right now, we'll start with Dr. Coyote Smith, on Colin Gray. So welcome, Dr. Smith. Thanks, Coyote, for being here today.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's awesome to be here. And hello, everyone out there. I hope you're having a great day and enjoyed Memorial Day weekend with fun, sun, and barbecue. Today, I am dressed in gray because it's my job to introduce one of my favorite academics, Professor Colin S. Gray. And if you would, please cue the slides. Fantastic. Well, as Chris pointed out, we have a new space warfighting framework for planners, and it begins with an opening epigraph based on a quotation from a book published in 2005. The title of the book was Another Bloody Century by Colin S. Gray. And he says, and I'll read it for you, "It is a rule in strategy, one derived empirically from the evidence of 2.5 millennia, that anything of great strategic importance to one belligerent for that reason has to be worth attacking by others. And the greater the importance, the greater has to be the incentive to damage, disable, capture, or destroy it. In the bluntest of statements, space warfare is a certainty in the future because the use of space in war has become vital." This is a statement that he would make in several different ways over the course of his career, in many different places, always related to that basic statement that warfare in space is a foregone conclusion because it is so valuable to the various players out there. So let's talk about who this Colin Gray is. Well, he was born in December of 1943 in Oxfordshire, England. He achieved a Bachelor of Arts degree in economics with honors at University of Manchester in 1965. And he received his Doctor of Philosophy in International Politics from the Lincoln College of Oxford University in 1970. He spent some time working in London in arms control jobs before he was actually introduced to President Reagan by Margaret Thatcher. From 1982 to 1987, Professor Gray served on the Reagan administration's General Advisory Committee for Arms Control and Disarmament. He contributed to studies on nuclear strategy, maritime strategy, space strategy, and special forces, advocating for the development of an Air Force Space Command, the Strategic Defense Initiative, and the Trust But Verify regime of the Strategic Arms Reduction talks. He founded a number of different organizations, including the Institute for Public Policy in Washington, D.C. He worked at the Institute for Strategic Studies in Washington, D.C. He was one of the directors of the Hudson Institute in New York City, and he also has served for many years as an advisor to both the British and the American governments on several strategic projects. He was a joint U.S.-UK citizen. He spent time teaching at a number of different universities, but what he'll be best remembered for is the over 30 books and 300 articles and monographs that he published over the course of his career. He is literally the best published person in the field of strategic studies. His work garnered him some widespread recognition, and in fact, the Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, once said of Colin Gray, he is the most near faultless strategist alive today. And behind this image here, you see a number of the books which he published. If you'd cue the next slide, please. You see, Modern Strategy by Colin Gray. I first read this book in the year 2000 in the springtime while I was a student at the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies. And I went to my advisor, Dr. Peter Hayes, whose name you may know. And I told him, if I ever get the opportunity to do a PhD under this gentleman's hand, I will do so. And in fact, it did work out that way. In 2007, the Air Force sent me to the University of Reading, where Professor Gray led the Center for Strategic Studies at the University of Reading, where I would go on eventually to cue the next slide, assist in writing and preparing the endnotes for Air Power for Strategic Effect. Colin was just brilliant. It was wonderful to work underneath him. And for my effort for that exercise, go ahead and clue the next slide. I received a bottle of Oban 14. I know the Scots pronounce it Oban, but Colin pronounced it Oban, so I'll go with Colin's pronunciation on this one. But let's dig further into what his concepts were and what thoughts he had on his worldview and strategy. Next slide. Colin Gray was a realist, but he referred to himself as a latter-day realist. He grew up and went through college in the 1960s, and he was imbued with kind of the liberal, idealistic type of mindset that a lot of people had at that time. However, once he graduated from Oxford in 1970 and went to work with the arms control community in London, he started wondering why there were always Russians around, and why all of the positions of those arms control institutes in and around Pall Mall and the other areas of London always seemed to take positions that were contrary to the national security interests of the United Kingdom. Anyway, his contact with reality changed his worldview perspective to becoming a classical realist. He was literally guided by the strategic writings of Thucydides, Sun Tzu, and Karl von Clausewitz. And in fact, he said that every desk should have those three books sitting on them. And in his estimation, those three authors stand peerless amongst strategic thinkers. He certainly imbued the fear, honor, and interest motivation of war that came from Thucydides. Know the enemy and know yourself. Lay many plans, strategy, from Sun Tzu. And of course, he was a constant acolyte of von Clausewitz. War is a political act to compel our enemies to do our will. He was a peace through strength guy. He believed in deterrence the old-fashioned way by having such a strong fist that if the adversary taunted you enough and you threw that fist, you would cost them so dearly that they would never throw it in the first place. As mentioned earlier, he advocated for an Air Force Space Command because he realized space was getting short shrift by the United States Air Force. Not that the Air Force was doing anything mean or sneaky regarding space, but the Air Force always took care of its primary mission of air power and frequently compromised second and third order missions such as space and cyber along the path. He suggests the Strategic Defense Initiative. President Reagan apparently asked him what his ideas were on how to win the Cold War. And Professor Gray said at that time, Mr. President, you sit on top of the world's leading economy. Your allies are the world's 8 leading economies. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union has a third world economy with the world's largest army overhead. You could outspend them into irrelevance. And he suggested that the way to do that was by going to space. He would describe space as an undefended border, and he was concerned that every nation on the earth has a border to outer space. He was also very insistent that when they started discussing the strategic arms reduction talks, that it be based on an inspection regime, trust but verify. But he was a realist in this sense that he recognized arms control is only possible when it's not needed, and it's impossible when it's needed the most. He was very lackluster on the value of treaties that you would make because they're only made out of the context of stress that leads to warfare. Next slide, please. Now, Gray, the strategist, he viewed strategy as the bridge that connected policy to actual taking action. It was a plan implemented to orchestrate the execution of resources towards the political goals. He defined strategy at the end of his life in a book called The Theory of Strategy as something to do with connecting the ends of policy with the strategic ways and the military means, with awareness of the assumptions that we're making all along the way. And he recommended hedging your bets against those assumptions, because many of those assumptions will fall through, because Murphy's Law does come into play with the field of strategy. And of course, he said strategy is hard. It's hard because the context always evolves. The belligerents involved are never the same. The technology available is very different. The cultures are very different. And this is important because he said that all warfare is cultural. He was an advocate of studying strategic cultures. He, along with a number of people such as Sir Lawrence Freedman, Keith Payne, identified strategic culture as a central theme in the 1980s that described national styles of the way different countries dealt with certain kinds of problems. For example, the French, very famous for their diplomacy. The British, very famous for their diplomatic corps. Russia, very famous for their subterfuge, that they like to stir things up and see what falls out. The Chinese, with their concepts of deception and secrecy. And the United States, oftentimes accused of cowboy diplomacy. There's a reason why those types of stereotypes build up around a definition of national style. And Colin and that team of characters investigated that further. He also made the assertion that strategy is eternal and universal, almost like laws of physics. It is a plan put together to unite the goals with the resources, means, and the ways at hand. And that remains a universal and eternal thing. We use strategy to improve our engagement with reality, as the academic John Sumida would assert, and Colin agreed with that. Next slide, please. So on space power, Colin was particularly strong. He had just a handful of works dedicated to the concept of space power, but after around 1985, 1986, virtually all of his writings, whether they were articles or monographs, would always add in space as a normal domain along with air, land, and sea, and eventually cyber would come along as well. His first book in the field of space came with the publication of American Military Space Policy. In this work, he lamented that space power theory and doctrine had at least a 20-year deficit, and he's writing in 1982. He basically felt that we should have been baking space power, military space power, and the security that it provides, and the opportunities as well, from the very beginning. And he lamented that it was not so. By 1986, he published an article titled The Influence of Space Power Upon History. Here he was taking the title from Alfred Thayer Mahan, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And in this article, Gray asked, where is the Mahan for space? He wasn't looking for somebody to just rip off and copy Mahan's theory, but someone that would rise to the stature of Mahan in describing and discussing and laying out a theory of space power. He wrote the introduction to Oberg's book, Space Power Theory. Work on space power theory, he noted in the introduction, invites an assault. Every time he had mentioned space power theory, he would receive insults and open political assaults from those people who found it morally reprehensible, either because of their dreamy idealism standing in the way or because they represented foreign powers in their advocacy for the prevention of the development of space power. His monumental book, which I consider his very best, published in 1999, was Modern Strategy. Herein, he has an entire section of a chapter dedicated to space power, where he lays out a number of maxims that demonstrate that space power is strategically and logically the same as air, land, and sea. He points out that it's unrealistic to expect human behavior beyond the 100-kilometer Van Karman line to be better than human behavior here on Earth, because humans in space are like humans on Earth. And our goals, our objectives, and those motivations that will lead to actions in space will be the same as what leads to actions here on Earth. He also points out very bluntly that if one loses the war for space, or in space, you will lose the war, because it is so critical to enabling operations in air, land, and sea. He just had to look at the success of Operation Desert Storm and the dependency that American and Allied forces had on those space capabilities to lay that claim. In his book, Another Bloody Century, which is where he made the the quotation that started my presentation and appears in the Space Warfighting Framework. On page 307 is where that quote can be found. He lamented once again that we are so far behind with developing space power theory and doctrine and a cogent strategy to advance spacefaring or space power that it really comes across as, why are we not doing this? And he lamented that space had become America's Achilles heel. One of his last articles that he wrote dedicated to space power was a chapter which appeared in a book prepared by National Defense University that was titled Theory Ascendant, Space Power and Challenge of Strategic Theory. He did believe that using strategic analogies to the other services and the other mediums of operation was essential, and he recognized that the maritime analogy held more true for space than the air power analogies. Let's go to the next slide. So let's run through some of Colin Gray's blending of his realist perspective with his strategy. Colin Gray would be happy if we have a space force, but it arrived 50 years too late for his liking. He felt that the division between air and space needed to take place sooner, and that space power would be able to advance its interests much further if it were separate from the Air Force. He'd be happy that the Space Force budget has increased, but we're still in the Department of the Air Force. And he worries that relying on the Air Force for support will somehow water down that budget or the authority that Space Force personnel actually have. He was happy that we had an outer space treaty, but he realized that if we had migrated towards conflict, that the outer space treaty is not worth the paper it's printed on. He's happy that we're waking up to space threats, but he'd be upset that we're not doing anything about them, at least not taking action yet. He'd be delighted that the President of the United States is supporting Golden Dome, a further expansion of the Strategic Defense Initiative, which he championed. But he also would point out that Congress is already being lobbied against it, presumably by those dreamy idealists and those foreign powers that throw money around in D.C. to garner influence. We are discussing space superiority, and that's a necessary discussion. But one of the shortfalls of the Space Warfighting Framework is that we failed to discuss what we should do with it. We should be discussing offensive strikes from space, and we're not getting there yet, but it's a good first step. Happy that space power technology is advancing, but angry because it's advancing faster in other countries. We took our eye off the ball, and we have really slowed down and ground to a near halt in terms of the speed of type of space success. We are having success in the commercial sector, and that's necessary and good, but we need to harness that quickly in our security sector as well. You'd be happy that we're discussing space policy and professional military education, but he'd point out that we need to be teaching those space threats and how to get after them. More than anything else, he'd be happy that we're discussing space strategy here today. Strategy is an activity. It's a verb. It's a constant massage. And he'd be happy that our leaders are asking necessary questions, but we need to be helping them finding a strategy based on the goals that have been set for us and the ways and means that we have at our hands. And with that, I turn it over to you, Chris.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Coyote, for that presentation. And obviously, there's tons of questions that come to mind, and we'll get to those in a minute. We're going to now try to see if Dr. Brent Ziarnick is able to connect with us. Are you on with us, Brent?
So thanks a lot. The first thing that I should probably say is that I don't have a whole lot about Corbett's background, but I can speak to it. Corbett is not a space power theorist. He is a naval thinker, usually addressed in the same breath as Alfred Thayer Mahan. And that's what I want to sort of talk about initially, is what Mahan did, or what Mahan wrote about, what he advised versus what Corbett talked about. Why is that? Because of what Dr. Smith, Coyote, said about something that Dr. Colin Gray said, which is the maritime analogy is often better for space than perhaps the air analogy. I take that to a fairly large extreme. which is that space is really just a maritime environment based on not water versus vacuum, but that they're both, domains that humans find intolerable without advanced technology. And it's actually the strategic understanding of space and maritime, space and the sea are close together so much. Not so much because of their physical attributes, but because of our technological dependence to exploit those attributes. But that's another discussion. But who was Julian Corbett? Well, I might be a little bit different than some by saying he was a romance novelist and a lawyer. That's how he started out. And he wrote a book called Forgotten Gold, which a lot of people consider a late 19th century version of a Harlequin romance novel, or a bodice ripper, if you want to say that. It was a historical romance about Sir Francis Drake in the 1500s and sort of developed British sea power. And from that, he really got into the historical, research on the Tudor Navy and other things, and started writing a lot about, naval strategy and naval history. Became friends with someone that would eventually become the first Lord of the Admiralty, Admiral Sir Jackie Fisher, and was sort of a defense intellectual ever since. And part of his not very extensive writing, but a very important piece of writing was Some Principles of Maritime Strategy, which we read in, I'm fairly certain, every PME course in the DoD, at least at the mid-level and senior level. But we tend to think of Julian Corbett as a great theorist, and he really wasn't, because he had no military experience, and he came to an understanding of military strategy by a civilian reading Karl von Clausewitz. And he made some interesting what you would call maybe commentary on Clausewitz. One in particular I think is brilliant, that's not really relevant here so far. But when we talk about Corbett as a theorist, he was what most people consider him a strategic level thinker, which is complete nonsense. He was an operational thinker, where he talked about maritime strategy, not naval strategy, because he wanted to bring in national strategy and army strategy and national strategy together in an operational picture during warfare, but ignored, unlike Alfred Thayer Mahan, who I like a lot more, actually talked about the grand strategic use of sea power. And that's really the issue that we have here. The Space Warfighting Framework is, I would say, not Corbettian, although Corbett has influenced quite a bit. I would say the Space Warfighting Framework is very John Kleinian. And at least in modern relevance, John Klein is without doubt the best thing that ever happened to Julian Corbett, because Klein's theories on space conflict and space combat are very, very useful. And a lot of them are born of an investigation of Corbett, but go very, very much farther beyond Corbett in, Command of the Sea and other such things. But because this is a combat theory that is very useful, his strategic advice is, in my opinion, very suspect. The one quote that he has that I guess we're talking about Corbett over because of the Space Warfighting Framework is, a discussion that to seek invulnerability is to fall into the strategical vice of trying to be superior everywhere. No. If you read into this, he says that to seek invulnerability is to forfeit the attainment of the essential for fear of risking the unessential. This is a very operational level, sort of campaign level thinking that is really crippling today's joint force, as well as, his understanding of naval strategy prior to and during the World War, in that you should always try to seek invulnerability if you can, but realize that you probably can't, but that shouldn't stop you from trying. Now, why is it that this particular quote, even though there's so many other things that Julian Corbett could say that would be very useful for the Space Force, why is it this quote that's in there? Well, I would argue that it's based on what Corbett was trying to do with this particular quote when he wrote it, which is to try to limit the influence of the Admiralty and the sea power theorists and the sea power advocates in the British Empire to push their requirements as hard as they were, and to give an out to the political establishment of the day that did not want to spend a lot of money on capital ships and other things to stay in the lead against, Imperial Germany, and give them, the academic fig leaf to hide behind when they made decisions that were poor strategically. And when I read this, this smacked very much so of an old Air Force Space Command thought from maybe 5 or 10 years ago called space sufficiency, which is not very useful to a new service that really needs to come into its own and become the warfighters they claim to want to be. Because if you don't want to seek invulnerability, you better know what the essential is and what the unessential is in Corbett's terminology. And Corbett really cannot say much about that. And really, in his time, as well as our own, this kind of language is trying to ensure that the people that determine what is essential versus unessential are people that don't really care much about the maritime or space environments or domains. But that being said, the Space Warfighting document is all Klein's work, and this work is very important insofar as if we're talking about warfighting, it is very useful. But if you ask me, the easiest way to understand the sea power analogy and the way it should be used is that Mahan teaches us why and how to build a powerful sea power state and a powerful navy, while Corbett can clarify the operational approaches on how to fight using that capability. And why the Space Warfighting Framework is, in my opinion, a little bit dangerous is because it is too useful, or it uses too much of Corbett without any strategic understanding, like Coyote said a little bit earlier, about how you're supposed to use your strength. And Mahan is very good in this respect, in that I think if you want to distill anything about Mahan from a grand strategic point of view, it says he said naval strategy has indeed for its end to found, support, and increase, as well in peace as in war, the sea power of a country. And then Corbett, in his chapter 1 on some principles of maritime strategy, explains the different things you can use that military sea power for during war times: securing command, disputing command, or exercising command. But what's interesting is that this checklist, or at least table, that Corbett has about what naval wartime operations are, is not in the space warfighting construct, which is, in my opinion, unfortunate. But this is the maritime view. If you go to my last slide, and then we can have the discussion and questions. This is why I think that, control effing or replacing space or sea with space is actually pretty useful in two different approaches. Because if we use a Mahanian space power approach, the Space Force strategy should be to found, support, and increase in peace and war the space power of a country, which the Space Force, in every public statement that I hear, tries to run away from. The most recent being, new advances in movement and maneuver dismissed as science projects. But Corbettian space power also has its thing to say, which is, what should the Space Force wartime operations be? Well, with a military space force worthwhile that can fight wars, it should secure command by decisive battle if possible, by blockading if possible, or disputing command, or exercising that command to help out the joint force. What Clausewitz says, or I'm sorry, what Corbett says is attack, defense, and support of military expeditions. If you want to apply Corbett to space, John Klein is the person to read. And if you can see me, I can at least put up one book like, Coyote did. It's not really, oh, wait a minute, there it is. Space Warfare, the second edition, just came out a couple of months ago, and it's a great read. It's far more expansive on what Klein says, and maybe even some of the positive things that Corbett says that Guardians might be able to use. But Corbett is not the end-all, be-all of space warfighting, nor should he be. So that's all I have to say, but hopefully
okay,
that was pretty useful, and we can go to some questions.
Yeah, so I'll ask the first question, and then for those of you that want to ask questions, feel free to write them in the chat box. If you're media, please let me know which media entity you're with if you're there in the chat as well. So the first question I have is of course, you talked about Klein, and you talked about Corbett and Mahan. One of the things that I noticed when I read the framework and I saw those two quotes was, like you mentioned, it seems like they're very operational focused, but they're using strategic quotes. With the exception with the Gray at least, and then Corbett the operational side. But since most of it seems to it talks about space superiority, but then because we really don't have the means to gain space superiority as a space force right now, as even the chief of space operations is finally beginning to tell Congress that, hey, we really don't have the space control, space superiority methodology, which I've been arguing for 5 years, since we really don't have the strength to do any of that, is that it seems very, very terrestrial focused. It's not so much in line with the strategic viewpoint that you mentioned, Brent, or that both Professor Gray and Coyote mentioned in their writings. And I'm just curious, am I seeing things? Is it really very terrestrial supportive? And to be honest with you, it also seems to be overly focused on the joint force versus the American homeland and society in general, given space power's interconnectedness. Let's go with Brent first, and then over to Coyote for comment.
Well, I'll try to be quick about it, but that is the problem with Corbett, is not so much what he wrote. Well, it's just like Mahan, really. It's not such a problem of what they wrote as what people read from it. And Corbett is in PME instruction now because he said that sea power and the navies should be subordinated to the interests of national strategy, or the joint force of his day, which back then, just as it is today, you spell joint ARMY, right? So right. Corbett is considered useful today for the Space Force because it defends the idea that the Space Force is there only, or at least overwhelmingly primarily, to support the joint force, which someone like Mahan would say is ridiculous. But, and then again, we won't get into it, but my quip, and I'm not going to defend it right now because it would take too long, is that the operational level of war doesn't exist. It was a communist Soviet plot to get American tacticians to think that when they think tactics, they're actually thinking strategy.
That's an interesting comment. We may have to have you come back with that one. So it's over to Coyote real quick. If you have any answers to that question.
No, I don't.
Okay, I guess that's good. So here's the next question from Chris Bosquillon. He wants to know, please elaborate on the problem of mirror imaging in strategic culture, how projecting Western values, quote unquote, on adversaries' intentions could lead to dangerous miscalculations regarding China and Russian space warfare moves. I'll start with Coyote on that one and then go to Brent.
This is actually a very important question, and I appreciate that you sent that in, Mr. Basquion. Anyway, Colin would say that those fall into the assumptions. You need to be very careful about the assumptions you make about your adversary, not just when you formulate the policy, but when you formulate your strategy, and with regard to what assumptions you're making about the adversary capabilities and your own capabilities. It goes back to a Sun Tzu statement, know yourself and know your enemy. He favored having regional teams of people that became experts and specializing in language skills and in cultural immersion, if you could find them. He also would say that you should leave your domestic and social policies to the liberals and the idealists, and leave your foreign policy and defense to your realists, as an inoculation to mirror imaging.
Nice. How about you, Brent? You have any comments on that question?
Well, I think Dr. Smith is absolutely right. We need to have as much cultural and social understanding of a potential adversary to really understand what their objectives are versus what our objectives are. I would just push back a little bit in that strategy and power does overlap an awful lot across cultures. I can read Sun Tzu and understand it, and most strategic guides, in the classics are from different cultures. The West is not a monoculture by any stretch. And, there's Germanic influences, English influences, and all that kind of stuff. But we can still read them and still understand. So it's not a panacea to say that we need to have no mirror imaging, but it's definitely something that needs to be sought at. But, good weapons speak to all cultures.
Right. I'll just mention it from my own perspective from seeing things is that I do see a lot of the mirror imaging because most of the doctrine and the strategy and other political documents that have come out of the Space Force and even U.S. Space Command, even the White House over the last 5 or so years at least, and before have been primarily assuming that everybody thinks like us. Like, you hear the commander of U.S. Space Command saying nobody wants war in space, while simultaneously you have the now retired Vice Chief of Space Operations, General Thompson, rightfully saying that we're attacked every day at the low threshold in space from the irreversible side of jamming, lasing, and things of that sort. And so we're dealing with a circumstance of 24/7, essentially low-intensity conflict going on in space right now, with a service that doesn't have the capabilities that are spoken by Corbett, much less Mahan, from a sea power to space analogy. And I was curious if you guys had any thoughts on that for folks that are listening going, I don't even know how a blockade could possibly be useful in space, given the fact there's no water per se. How exactly would you do that? And understanding that, Kepler and orbital mechanics and stuff make things different than floating in the water. Can any of you explain what a usefulness of a space blockade would be, especially given the fact that the Chinese are already talking about such things and are already posturing to do such things? Whichever one of you wants to go first, let me know.
Well, if you don't mind, I'll try it. Really, when you're talking about blockades and other such things, you have to adjust it a little bit. What you're really dealing with a blockade is trying to take away the lines of communication from space. So we talk about this kind of stuff all the time, jamming GPS, other stuff. Physically, maybe like Golden Dome might be protecting, people from missile strikes and other such things. That's really what people are talking about when they're talking about blockades, or really in Klein's framework, they're blockade, blocks and blockages and other such things, because blockade is actually an act of war, which you're not supposed to do unless you're at war. But blocking abilities is something that is routinely done from space. Now, you can't sit there and think, well, we're just going to float, a whole bunch of space battleships above, your target of reference. That's not going to happen, but it can be done suitably tailored to the domain of space itself.
How about you, Coyote?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Brent has just said. I think it's interesting that when we think about blocking, there's one rule of space power, one permanent rule, and that means no spectrum, no space power. And if you can dominate the electromagnetic spectrum, you can blockade space. And you can be selective about the frequencies. You're just denying those frequencies your adversary uses.
Would that matter if there was a more of a mixed force of manned and unmanned, given the fact that everything that we have up there is primarily unmanned and remote controlled from mission ground stations, things of that sort, or would that be no different?
I think it's no different. I think one of the things that will happen is that the other services are going to have to get used to providing their support to space assets. We're going to need aircraft to take out terrestrial threats. We're going to need naval gunning, taking out seaports. We're going to need armies with special operations teams going in and doing things to give us access to do cyber attacks. One of the things that concerns us the most is not that the Chinese will take down our proliferated constellations, but that they will be successful at doing a cyber attack against the ground station and take out or make irrelevant the entire constellation. Those are the types of things that we're worrying about. They keep me awake at night. Whew.
Yeah, I would say though that I think there is all that is valid. That the problem I'm seeing though, and maybe you've seen it, is that it seems that while it's true that we need to have air, land, and sea power supporting space power activities, but that we're not building the weapon systems that we need to gain and maintain space superiority. And so there seems to be a redefinition of terms that keeps going back and forth between what real space superiority is, where you're actually controlling the actual operating medium, versus just providing spectrum and products to air, land, and sea people. And so there was a general recently from the Space Force that made it sound like that it's almost more important to, instead of having a space planner or a space strategist think about addressing space issues through a space force, that it's better to do all your planning with using resources in the air, land, and sea instead. It's as if they're trying to deflect their responsibility almost from gaining real space superiority to just providing services. And I'm seeing General Saltzman sometimes talking in that direction, and recently we went in front of Congress talking more about how we don't have the capabilities to do what we need to do to, actively defend and deter and to win a war actually in space. One that, like I mentioned already, is happening at a lower threshold. Any thoughts on those observations? Let's go with Brent, I guess, first.
Well, again, this is why Corbett is particularly useful for the Space Force right now. Is that we can't seek invulnerability, and if you agree that we can't seek invulnerability, which at a certain level is absolutely true. Of course, we're not ever going to be invulnerable. But if you use that rhetoric enough, you can say, well, that allows us to not defend certain things, to pass the buck on certain responsibilities, and then just say, well, we weren't seeking invulnerability everywhere. We had to give up that because that was inessential. It's using military history, military writing to excuse inaction in a lot of ways. And this sort of, hey, we'll just leverage the Army, we'll leverage the Navy, we'll leverage all these people. The first, The first sort of rah-rah video about the Space Force and how space is a warfighting domain under General Raymond was a great little thing that they did at the Colorado Springs Space Symposium, where the bad guy jammer was taken out by an Aegis cruiser or an Aegis destroyer. And it's like, hey, isn't this great? Joint force, it's definitely it's a common theme that maybe civilian leadership has to put a quash on, but also advocates have to say, hey, look, we need actual honest to God space capabilities for military purposes.
Yeah, so let's real quick for questions. I got a couple of others pop up here. So one question from Elmo Buhafa: how can the United States deter adversaries from using space-based weapons? Any thoughts on that? And I have my own thoughts, but I'll let you guys talk.
Well, again, I'm echoing my inner Colin Gray here. You have to be the first on the scene with the biggest weapons possible and demonstrate the ability and willingness to use them on a regular basis to establish that credibility. it may be unfortunate, but that's how we preserve peace.
How about you, Brent?
I don't have much to say about deterrence, except I hate to say it because you're part of this group, but deterrence is probably something we need to talk a lot less about. And actual combat capability, we have to speak a lot more about, because probably in the final analysis, deterrence isn't a thing other than a byproduct of strength. When people talk about deterrence, they mean minimum deterrence, and minimum deterrence is no deterrence at all.
Yeah, I'll just say I write a lot on space deterrence for folks that may be new to the program. And one of the things that I found in my research and experience, actually as a space operator and strategy guy in my own right, is that especially with the Chinese, they are very much, their view of deterrence is the classical view, where it is based on how do you get into the mind of the adversary with a sufficiently strong military power that is not only capable of defending yourself, but is also capable of winning a full-up war. So with that capability and putting that pause in their mind, then that provides the ability for people to think twice in the commander or the political leader's mind to do that. And that's why we're seeing the Chinese building and posturing for what they're doing with a whole suite of weapon systems that can go all the way from reversible jammers to irreversible kinetic interceptors and even electromagnetic pulse, as well as the space-to-ground weapon systems, and in the case of Russia, possibly even a nuclear anti-satellite weapon back again. So we can't assume that just because and I've heard this excuse too. Oh, well, America is more reliant upon space capabilities than China and the others. Well, that's shifting. So that argument is starting to lose its validity in a lot of circles of people who are serious about it. But you definitely need to do that. So how do we keep them from using space-based weapons? On the kinetic side, we have to have the at least equal to or more capability than they do. On the reversible side, we've essentially let that become the new normal. So we've already been seeing jamming and lasing and other assorted space attack activity, radio frequency, high-powered microwaves, all the stuff that you're seeing in all these unclassified reports coming out of Congress, the DoD, and even the Office of Director of National Intelligence. So I think in order to deter, we have to show that we're willing to do that. We have to articulate what we have and are willing to use it, which we haven't really been communicating that because a lot of times we've been using strategic communications, such as the latest declaratory policy from the most recent defense space strategy, which is we reserve the right to respond to a space attack in a time, place, manner, and domain of our choosing. So that gets back to kind of my question earlier about how do we, and by the way, nobody that I'm aware of has ever responded to a space attack, whether reversible or otherwise, using air or land or sea strike capabilities, at least not during my military time. One other question that I have here from a Thomas Smith is, will AI come into play when developing these types of systems? And my quick answer would be yeah, but I'll let our guest answer more on that. So start with Coyote.
Yes, artificial intelligence is going to have a big play in helping us keep track of things. If it's just that simple, it would be a tremendous advantage just keeping track. Right now, this morning, there were 11,975 operational satellites on orbit. And that number changes all the time as spares come up or other satellites die or certain satellites that have some damage to them for whatever solar reasons, they lose some capabilities and we have to shift things around. Knowing what's going on orbit is essential. But the other thing about artificial intelligence is it will assist us in doing designs that hopefully will be more simple, more elegant, and better, higher fidelity, and cost less. We're really looking forward to that type of return on the investment.
Anything to add there, Brent? Dr. Ziarnick?
It's a great tool, but again, it's not a panacea either. We're still going to have to give good thoughts, because anyone that's actually used AI knows that sometimes it's brilliant and other times it is completely off the wall. Garbage in, garbage out is still a thing.
Yeah, so I was curious. One other thing that I noticed, and I usually try to give my guests an opportunity to speak a little bit more about what they think should be done in the future at the end of conversation, since we're getting close to the end of our time for the event today. So let me play the devil's advocate, and also sort of the viewpoint of a lot of old timers that are still engaged. And I say that with total respect. Old timers meaning people who have been a part of the space world in various capacities and various services, various agencies, and even some of the industrial side for years and years and years, even decades. And sometimes when I talk to these folks and get their 2 cents on things, they seem to never get their mind off of the space as a terrestrial support function, and that's really why it's there. It's to help make air targeting more efficient, command and control more time efficient. Pretty much you throw efficiency on just about everything, but to make it better so you can have a smaller force and still have a bigger bang for your buck kind of a thing. Why shouldn't the Space Force be looked at and postured to be simply seeing warfighting as simply a warfighting support function? Why is that not a good thing for the Space Force? Whichever wants to go first.
My quick response would be because you're ignoring the grand strategic aspects of the space domain itself. Operationally, we should follow Corbett in his approach to space warfighting. That's why John Klein's theory is sort of codified in the Space Warfighting Framework. The problem is if you keep yourself at the operational level, you completely ignore the possibilities for national power through space. And it's very important not to put blinders on to strategists, to free, and innovative thinkers and other things. And right now, if I had anything to say about it, I would say right now, Corbett has done a great service to the Space Force because he has pushed, naval and maritime thinking as, into Space Force thinking, which is unreal. Now what we need to do is start to explore other lessons from the sea domain via Mahan, Wolfgang Wegner, other people, to really take space from that, it's an army mentality is what the Air Force mentality is, and put it into the sort of navalist mentality, which is the United States becomes powerful from space. And yes, everything that we do in space is supposed to make life here better on Earth. That's true. But that isn't what people think when the Space Force just thinks of itself as satellites and ground support stations. Space is far more important than that. And I would say if I wanted to push anything forward, it would be let the Space Force be space enthusiasts.
And I'll just mention to folks who are curious, either my first or one of my first Real Space Strategy podcasts, I had Dr. Ziarnick on, and we talked about a classic Cold War Air Force general named Thomas S. Power. He wrote a biography on him and about how he is really the father of what the Space Force could and should be. So if you're interested in that episode, if you go to the website, you'll be able to find that link to that podcast. Also, before I get to Coyote, since we're throwing books at everybody today, let me just show you this. This is a copy of his book, Developing National Power in Space. So by Dr. Ziarnick, it came out a few years ago. If you're interested on his thoughts on that and what it means since we were running out of time, that would be great. And it looks like Andre likes your book, highly recommends it in the comments here. Coyote, real quick, and then I have one more question after this one. What do you think about that comment on why should the Space Force not be seen as strictly a terrestrial support service based on Corbett?
Because the terrestrial forces can't do it by themselves. If you just take a look at what's happened in Russia and Ukraine and that war there, they are at a standstill. Aircraft aren't cracking the problem. Artillery's not cracking it. Land forces are not. But if they were to do strategic strike from space and open up holes, they would suddenly enable their terrestrial forces again. I strongly advocate electromagnetic jammers on orbit that can raise the electromagnetic threshold in order to allow certain types of aircraft or vessels to flow into the battle area. I also recommend lasers in order to put down targeting and acquisition radars to create even larger holes so that our traditional forces can flow in.
Would you be interested in coming back on as a general? Just kidding.
Yes, I would.
So one last question, since we're getting to the end here, but this is a good question. So if you can squeeze this into a few minutes max, Brent, there's a question from Peter Garrettson here. It says, question for Brent Ziarnick. Please elaborate on Wegener and what lessons we should learn from him. So if you give him the Cliff Notes version and what his book's title is, maybe people can take a look at that.
Sure. Admiral Wegener was an Imperial German Navy officer during the Great War. Served on the deck of the battleship that is I can't remember it. What was the battleship that was sunk by Billy Mitchell?
Ostfriesland.
Yeah, the Ostfriesland. He was actually on the deck of the Ostfriesland during the Jutland campaign, which is sort of a fun little tidbit. But he survived that, and then realized that even though the Germans were war-fightingly successful, tactically they did more damage to the Royal Navy during the Battle of Jutland than the Royal Navy returned. It was a tactical victory, but a strategic defeat. And Wegener, when he was an admiral, years later in the 30s, tried to figure out why this was the case. And he determined that it was because the Royal Navy had the positions of sea power already, and they did not need to seek battle during the World War. They just needed to make sure the Germans were kept in their port. The High Seas Fleet was kept in port by the Grand Fleet. And it's a very interesting discussion about what navies are supposed to do during peacetime versus wartime, and the bad effects of over-reliance on a war-fighting ethos. Wegener essentially said that the German Navy did nothing during peacetime to improve their positions on the sea. They just thought that battle would lead to victory, and that absolutely was not the case. So if anyone wants to read The Naval Strategy of the World War by Wolfgang Wegener, you can find it used in a lot of different places. There's not a new version. So if anyone knows Naval Institute Press, get them out there. But it's a very good, counterpoint for an over-reliance on warfighting strategy, which I would argue the U.S. Space Force is absolutely falling into the same problem as the Imperial German Navy.
But without the weapons like the German Navy had.
Well, yeah, at least they had cool battleships, right?
Yeah, some of those. Okay, last words from you, Coyote, before we wrap up today.
I'd just like to thank you for having me here today.
No problem. Brent, any last words?
Is that regarding my career?
No, just for the episode.
No, it was really good. I was going to ask. I thought you were going to offer me a blindfold and a cigarette, but no. Thanks for letting me be on. I really enjoy this discussions. Hopefully, it wasn't too bad. And sorry for the computer issues. So
no problem.
I hope everyone enjoyed it. Maybe if their blood pressure's up, good. If not, at least hopefully we kept you awake.
Awesome. Well, with that, I want to thank everybody for being with us today. So if you have friends and family that you think might be interested in such discussions from the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, Real Space Strategy Live, feel free to share it. And for that, with that, thank you very much for being with us, and we'll talk to you again later. Take care.